Are you personally mourning the loss of TikTok today? Today is the 19th of January. The app was officially banned starting today, and I know a lot of people who are pretty distressed about this decision. Welcome back to Simplify. In today's video, I want to spend a few minutes just talking about TikTok, acknowledging some of the great things that the app has brought, and also talk about some of the sides around banning this particular app, what the arguments are, whether or not there's any validity to these arguments, and how we should collectively be thinking about this issue moving forward. I'll start by saying that TikTok has been a pretty transformational social media platform. It basically allowed a voice to any individual who had something to say and wanted to post a short video about that particular issue. The algorithm-based system that TikTok deployed was different from all the other applications. It really pushed out different pieces of content to people who are interested in the topic. And this was done based upon the actual content topic versus a person who you know and want to follow and want to learn more about. I think this idea is phenomenal, and TikTok has been credited in its short 6.5-year lifespan with really transforming the social media space in a way that hasn't been seen. So because of that, I definitely want to acknowledge that this application has done some really cool things. I know a lot of businesses that absolutely rely on TikTok. They need it in order to push out their products and get their message out. I know a lot of companies that have adopted this particular marketing strategy solely around TikTok and have reached a much wider audience than perhaps they otherwise would have, just using some of the more traditional forms of social media, marketing, and advertising. And so why are we sitting here with this unique app that's really changed the game being banned in the United States? Now, there are lots of claims about this being a money grab, a power grab. There are also claims that TikTok, which is owned by parent company and Chinese company ByteDance, is actually potentially using data and mining that data, feeding it to the Chinese government, and using it to manipulate and compromise national security. I haven't seen a lot of proof or evidence that these claims are real, but I do know that in national security space, a lot of these issues would not necessarily be open for public consumption, and there likely is some cause for concern here that we should be thinking about. However, it's not very clear from the public's perspective what these threats are and why they're so important right now. Now, just to be clear, I think it's important to recognize that TikTok is actually not storing data within China. I think most of their data storage centers are actually in Singapore and or in the United States, but they aren't actually storing a lot of their information on servers that are owned and operated within China. I think this is an important distinction, but it certainly isn't necessarily the only consideration that's important here. I personally understand both sides of the argument, and I think that this is a debate that I'm really glad is happening right now. I think ultimately, freedom of speech is the most important thing. I think we've seen a lot of changing of opinions from politicians based upon how this particular application is either hurting them or helping them. So that hasn't been very useful, I think, from a public perspective. We've seen Donald Trump go from absolutely agreeing with a ban on TikTok to now supporting that ban be lifted. And so this is very confusing to see these different sides. And obviously there's always a reason why a certain line is being taken. So politics aside, there are good arguments on both sides. What I want to do here today is acknowledge that both of these sides exist, that a debate should be happening right now, and we should be collectively as a society trying to better understand the risks of applications that are foreign owned, how our data is being secured and utilized. Ultimately, a more appropriate course of action is likely to revise laws in and around data privacy and how information is stored and utilized by these companies, whether or not this data can be sold or accessed or manipulated in any way. I think we need to evolve with the evolving technologies and make sure that we're legislating things into place that protect the average citizen who's engaging in these social media platforms as either a source of business or a source of personal pleasure. On top of that, I think the terms of agreement that these companies require individuals to accept need to become much more transparent. They need to offer very clear ideas about the sacrifices you're making and the things that you're accepting by clicking agree when you do utilize one of these applications. I don't know about you, but for me, when I see a 100-page document of terms and agreements, I automatically check out. I know there's no way I'm going to be able to read and digest this entire document. If I want to use the application badly enough, I just agree to the terms. At the same time, I know this is dangerous. I know this is not a good practice. I also think over time, if enough bad things happen based upon one of these agreements, that change is likely to come. I just hope that one of these things doesn't affect me personally, and so I accept the terms and conditions. But this is a risky behavior. So in addition to modifying how data is utilized by these companies, I think we should look at modifying requirements around transparency with user terms and agreements. When people do utilize these services, they should know exactly what they're agreeing to, when they agree to it, and it should be made simple enough that someone can digest that agreement in a short amount of time and say yes or no, I accept these terms. At the same time, I think individuals have the right to make decisions about what they give up in their personal lives. If they agree to give up certain amounts of personal information to utilize a service that a business is offering, that is the choice of an individual. I wholeheartedly stand behind the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and I think it's critical that we protect this right and not ban applications that allow us to share opinions and circulate our ideas to a broader audience. In this case, TikTok is the example. I think it's been an extremely successful business. It's done some very unique things that have proven to be excellent for the economy within the United States. And there are some dangers to outright banning an application like this that so many people have come to depend on. I also want to point out a very obvious truth that sometimes foreign-owned companies that operate in the United States, although they have to abide by the laws within the United States, they also may have different principles, different values that they operate under. They may come from a different culture or society where certain things are not as important. And in this case, maybe civil liberties are not as important, or protection of personal data and information might not be as important. I think this strengthens the argument for passing more legislation in the United States that protects the individual consumer and the data that that consumer shares with the company in order to use the service. Now, in terms of TikTok, I think that this storm will blow over relatively quickly. I think President Trump will come in after inauguration. He will lift the ban on TikTok temporarily, allowing for a longer period of time under which discussions will be had and some form of agreement that would transition ownership or at least provide partial ownership of the company to a US-based entity over time. I think that's what's going to happen. Of course, I don't know with any certainty that this will happen, but that's my prediction. And I think people will again be back on TikTok relatively quickly. The longer the ban goes on, the more likely it is that users of TikTok will disperse into other applications, smaller applications, and they'll try to regain some of the business or some of the notoriety that they had on TikTok. This has some risks because there's an obvious competitor straight out of China. I think it's called Redbook. But this competitor application is growing in popularity right now. People are jumping off to that and transitioning some of their content. Others are pushing off to Instagram and Facebook, and I think there's more security obviously in that. But some of these applications actually are owned and operated within China, and so all of your data directly is sent to China and stored on servers within China. So there are some potential risks here to not coming to an agreement relatively soon on how TikTok will be able to operate and if it will be able to operate in the United States. Now again, I'll say my personal opinion is that people should be able to make their own decisions about the applications that they use. I certainly understand the argument around national security, and I definitely understand the provisions around wanting US-based ownership versus foreign ownership. I think laws should be enacted to protect us from certain amounts of influence that foreign governments can have by running and owning these applications in the United States, but a much more thought out plan of action needs to come into place that definitely preserves the First Amendment to the greatest degree possible, while also protecting people from the potential risks that could exist in the future if some sort of malicious intent ever does arise. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the TikTok ban. How does this make you feel? Are you impacted negatively? Do you have a business that relies on TikTok as a source of marketing and advertisements? Throw down in the comments below the things that you're thinking right now about this particular issue. Do you think that the risks to national security are real? Or do you just think that this is a ridiculous thing that shouldn't be happening at all? Both sides have valid arguments in certain cases, and so I would encourage you to learn both sides of the argument and try to understand the rationale behind each. If you enjoyed this discussion or you'd like to hear more from me on this issue, please let me know below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, there's no better time than now. Thanks again for all of your support, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week for another video.